Hello and welcome to the Zach Think Share podcast. I'm excited today. Marina, you are joining me. I think I reached out within like 45 minutes of hearing your voice for the first time. Uh, I listened to the episode you did with, I forget what her name is, on the
Tori
financial feminist
Dunlap.
podcast.
Yes.
And there are so many moments where I was like, I feel like I felt called to like bring more ears, bring more eyeballs to this situation. I know I have a 91% woman audience, and I think there's so many more people that need to hear this message. And I think as I was writing out some of my goals for the year and looking at like where I want my career to go as I became an entrepreneur full time last year, I
Mm.
saw that one of the things that I really care about is helping invisible labor be seen,
Mm-hmm.
as well as like improving the woman experience on this planet and using my all the privilege that I have as a tall, white, male, cisgender, like all those things, like trying to use that and use my platform to boost that. Your book, The
Yeah.
Vagina Business, that you were talking about on there,
Mm-hmm.
which even as I'm saying it, I can like, my stomach just felt a little funny as that came out.
Yeah. Here it is. Woo.
I thought that some of the things you talked about on that podcast were hard to hear for me. Like in a good way that a couple of years ago it wouldn't have been a blip on my scale. And I was thinking about like, what is it like to be an author of this book? What is it like to be a person that has the label of, oh, she wrote the Vagina book? What's it like holding the mental and emotional labor of being associated with the Vagina business book?
Yeah. That's a brilliant question. And I'm so glad that you reached out. I think the work you do is really important and really special. And I certainly asked myself that question when I started thinking about this book. It arrived together with the title. I had the idea for the book and it was called The Vagina Business. And then I thought, hang on a moment. Do I really want to be that person that when people spot me in the supermarket one day, they might say, isn't she the one who wrote about vaginas? And I spoke to my partner and my mother and one of my best friends, and they all said yes. You're the perfect person for this. You got to go for this. And that's all the confirmation that I needed. But it's always been a challenge and it continues to be a challenge. So initially, when my agent and I, when we went out to different publishers to sell the book, everybody said, yeah, this is a brilliant book, but are you sure about the title? And there are lots of explanations I was given. One of them was, the sales teams inside the publishing house that are responsible for pitching the book to Amazon or to Barnes and Noble, they might be embarrassed by the word, so they won't do a good job of pitching it. That was one reason. Um, and I kept saying, okay, but the whole point of the book is to destigmatize the conversation and to normalize the conversation. So it's really important to have the word on the cover. And they ran a big marketing research project where I was asked to come up with 16 alternative titles for the book. One of them was When Women Are Well. It would be a very different book if it was called that. But they ran this research project, and guess which title won?
The one that the world needs, the one that women in the world are, I think, for it to have,
Exactly.
be sensational, desperate to be at the forefront of our attention.
Yeah. And I think women are tired of euphemisms. There are so many euphemisms for everything to do with the female body. And okay, sometimes that can be cute. But when 2/3 of young women are too embarrassed to say the word vagina at the doctor's office, you have a problem. And so there's a difference between something being private and something being shameful. And I think that's why it was so important for me to have the word on the cover. And I'm a journalist. I've won various awards. I've written for some of the most prestigious publications in the world. I'm also an adjunct professor at the NYU Stern School of Business in London. And so I thought, I'll take all of my prestigious titles and I'll throw that at vagina, because people will think, okay, she's a serious person. And I have a really long bibliography in the book as well with all of the research and all of the evidence. So that was a thought that I had. But then when the book came out, there was one venue that refused to host my book launch. simply because of the title. There was another author who didn't want to write me a blurb. She's quite a well-known feminist, and she said, I don't want to be associated with that. And more recently, my book has been shortlisted for an award, and that shortlist was supposed to be announced at a big event in Dubai. And then a few days before the event, the organizer called me and she said, "We're not allowed to say that word in Dubai."
Wow.
So they announced it elsewhere. Yeah. So it continues to be a really interesting challenge.
Something that I felt called to. So I mean, almost immediately, I made a green screen video talking about the podcast and how like the word vagina, the word vulva, like all the things in the female anatomy are like it's like hush hush, or it's like taboo terms. It felt important for me to speak to that, and I feel like there's moments where I have the privilege of being, um, some version of a mentor for a lot of other guys. What do you think are one of the either euphemisms that we need to let go of ASAP, or what, like, is it the word vagina that we just need to say more? Like if you were to say, like, Zach, uh or if I would say, Marina, next 100 videos, I'm encouraging you to give me like a direction, like, and or all the creators that you work alongside of, like, you have our platform as a mouthpiece. Like, what would you encourage the most for people to speak louder with their full chest about? Like, what words would they use? What things would they say differently?
Hmm. Yeah, just use the accurate terms. Like you've said, vulva, vagina, menopause, period, rather than saying that time of the month or whatever it is that people say. And it's really context dependent, but we know the real words. And especially in a medical context, it's so important to use them. And some of the most powerful feedback I've received from readers who have read the book was from people who've said, you've made me reconsider how I talk to my daughter, or I have finally had a conversation with my mother where we didn't use euphemisms. And I think that's so powerful because so many of these conversations begin in a family or at home or with close friends. And so I think it's just important to know what the terms are and to use those terms. But
Mm.
it does depend on the context that you're in as well.
Well, I'll give you this one. So, I mean, we have a 3-year-old, almost three and a half, and we're looking at, she's been in daycare for the past 2 years. We're looking at her going into a next daycare. And, one of the concerns as a parent is like, is she going to be in safe places besides, her behavior changing? Like, let's say there was abuse at the daycare. Like, how would she communicate about that? And I've been thinking about, like, just introducing the word vulva to her as like, someone touched your vulva. Like, her being able to communicate that, I know, would be really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's research that backs that up, which you may have seen that children who do know these words are more likely to
Yeah.
be able to express them
Report
and to
abuse.
report things.
Yeah. And I think then there's the second piece, and I was a high school and a middle school teacher for a while.
Hmm.
And I made a video back in 2017. I had a pride flag in my classroom, and I remember the comments. That was my first ever really viral video of like 100,000, and there were a lot of comments in there saying like, keep that pornographic, keep that stuff out of our classroom, from a lot of folks. And I think to myself, like, wow, like, we can't even talk about like sexual, not even necessarily identity, but like, struggling with words at the moment. The people that we love, like, we can't even talk about homosexuality and heterosexuality in a public setting in an eighth grade classroom where seventh grade they're supposed to get sex ed, at least in
Mm,
Massachusetts.
yeah.
Is there, I'm sure you've come across in your research, like, what are those early ages that it's it's probably more valuable than it is harmful for them to know? Like, is it just as soon as they can talk, like, she should be able to say, this is my vulva?
Yeah, I think so. Because most parents are going to call it something. And I think what's amazing with young people is that they don't necessarily have that whole perception of shame and taboo and so on, right? So
Mm.
they have the capacity to just find their body endlessly fascinating. And so the way that you talk about menstruation, I heard somebody describe it as you have a red flow and you have a white flow. And then she would explain what that means in terms of the menstrual cycle and cervical fluid. And I think there is so much that is really fascinating about the female body that if you can get that fascination across, it's really powerful. And also having an element of sexual wellness and sexual pleasure in sex education rather than it all just being about the dangers of sex. Because there is research to show that sex education is more effective if it includes sexual pleasure.
When you were doing the research for the book, what were some of the surprising things? Where was there anything that like you were about as you were about to write a chapter or you were learning about something that you did some research and you're like, oh shoot, that was not the way that I thought this chapter was going to go.
Yeah, I think there are so many moments like that because you kind of think you know about your own body, but there are so many things that we don't know and so many things that we can learn about. And there's a chapter I have on contraception. And I knew that I wanted to focus on non hormonal contraception because I think that's the future. We need more options that are not hormonal. And I write about FemTech. Have you heard the word FemTech before?
From that podcast, yeah.
Just to take a step back first before I explain the contraceptive part. So, my book, The Vagina Business, is about FemTech. FemTech stands for female technology. So, that's tech focused on female bodies. And it's a term that was coined by the founder of Clue, which is a period app. The founder, Ida Tin, coined it in 2016. And she wanted to create a term that investors could use to refer to all of these companies in the space that focus on female bodies, from period apps to devices focused on urinary incontinence. And she wanted to create a term they could use without feeling embarrassment. So instead of saying, I have a portfolio company that helps women not pee their pants, they could say, I have a femtech company in my portfolio. And so that's
Mm,
how it came about. And in the book, I add a few more things to the definition. I see it as an idealistic term or, a positive term. I look at innovation that moves women's health forward. And I also see it as a movement. So I don't just look at products and services, but I look at research and the wider space that focuses on women's health. So that's what FemTech is. And so I've spent several years looking for innovation focused on everything from periods to fertility and birth, menopause, but also health issues beyond reproduction. So, heart health and bone health, for example. And contraception was one of those areas I wanted to look at. And I didn't plan initially to include any contraceptive inventions that are focused on men because that's not technically femtech, right? But I decided to include a company that's creating a novel form of contraceptive for men because I think that the burden of contraception has been placed on women for too long.
mm,
And in the US, 3/4 of couples rely on women for long term contraception, which I think is quite mind boggling when you think about the fact that an egg only lives for up to 24 hours, but then sperm can always get you pregnant, right? So there's
mm,
an imbalance in what an egg can do and what sperm can do. And yet we place all of the responsibility, or we typically place a lot of the responsibility on women. And historically, male contraceptives have focused on condoms and vasectomies. And now
mhm.
there's a company called Contraline.
I can still hear you.
Can you?
Yep.
I think my image is gone. Is yours still there?
Yeah, that's just Riverside deals with it on its own.
Oh, okay,
It'll
so I
still come
can.
out fine. Yeah, keep going. Yeah. Wait, did you say it's a hormonal vasectomy? I'm not sure how much of that just recorded. Hoping she can hop right back in. One of the, as I'm helping her get back in, one of the things that I thought was really interesting, which I was going to reference, was I was watching, for those of you that are familiar with Working Moms, is a Netflix series, and that was one of the things that they talked about in the latest season was this fictional drug called Seedless. And Seedless, the idea of it was that it was a similarly, like, it was a male contraceptive that they were starting to have worries about whether they would actually take it. I'm going to pause. So I'm not very good at multitasking. Where are you? But yeah, so the idea of it was that they were creating this drug. The goal of it was for them to have the men, manage their contraception, and at the same time, women were like, "Oh, I don't know if I actually trust him to do this appropriately. I don't know if I trust him to carry the mental load to do the invisible labor of managing this, and we can't really afford to have another kids. I can't afford to have him drop this ball. If there are balls in our house that can drop, there are rubber balls and there are glass balls, and this is absolutely a glass ball." So I thought it was really interesting. There are a lot of moments where it absolutely, I think it's fair for a lot of women to be considering, like, how and or if they're going to let their partner take ownership around some of the things that they could be owning in the home. I think that's a huge part of what I'm working on with a lot of couples, is trying to help men see, understand, develop systems for owning much more of the mental load within their homes and building trust with their partners. A lot of women have every right to be concerned and feel like they're not, having a fair contributor in their home. And so working on how do we go about building that trust back up? How do we step by step improve the way that we go about owning the mental load in our home? I think the way that I go about coaching people is, having weekly meetings with their partners so that they can get ahead of some of that thinking that they're having. Marina,
Sorry about that.
as you dropped off, I just kept running with wherever it blacked out for about 15-20 seconds. No worries. But I was just saying that I was
Oh, yeah, yeah.
watching back
Yeah,
in,
yeah.
I
Oh,
think
it's
it was July
brilliant.
or August, we finished watching Working Moms. I don't know if you're familiar with that show on Netflix, but the most recent season was like the Seedless company
Oh,
where
I
he
haven't
was
seen it yet.
creating the male contraceptive and they were doing PR work for him. And like, yeah, okay, I won't ruin it. It was a really good season. I think that last one, I think, would be such a great thing for you to noodle on and seeing how they play with it, because that was one of the issues, was like, okay, this Seedless thing works and it helps. I think it was a
Yep.
hormonal drug to just take the semen out of the sperm, so they're just shooting blanks. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the one of the concerns was, okay, do we actually trust our husbands to do this? And in our house, Alyssa recognized she wanted to go off birth control. And
Mm-hmm.
so we've been using condoms for, I think, probably the past, I think we're around a year now, as I've been accountable for making sure that I'm wrapped up before, we
Great.
have intercourse, because we're not ready for our next kid yet.
Yeah.
I don't know how much of what you were
Yeah.
sharing
So
got cut
basically,
off, but you
I
were
looked at
saying that there's
various
something
research and I
interesting that you
saw
had
a survey
found when
that
you
said
guys
that
were
only
looking at the
2% of women, and this was done across multiple cities, would not trust their partners with contraception. And obviously, a survey is different from a real life scenario when you're in the heat of the moment, compared to filling
mm,
out the survey. But I think it still gives us reason to be optimistic. And then there was another promising detail I saw in a study which was done in 2016. You may remember this story. There was a male version of the pill that went into clinical trials. It was hormonal, and men experienced various side effects from mood swings to acne. So basically, the ones that we ask women to put up with were experienced by men in this trial. And so it was abandoned and it didn't come to the market. And there was a similar hormonal injection that was trialed as well,
mm,
which caused side effects didn't come to the market. But there was a really revealing detail in that study, which was at the end when those participants were asked whether they would like to keep taking something like that, 82% of them said yes. So I think men are ready to step up. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a small detail, right? Yeah, because I think I I there's definitely a moment when you were bringing up of like,
Contraception. Yeah.
can and or will men own the mental load of managing contraception? And my first thought was like, I'm up for the task, and like the
Yeah,
immediate
it is.
visceral response is like, oh, what is that going to do to my body? That's like concerning. And because it's, I think that if there were already a bunch of other men doing it, getting acne and like dealing with the hormonal shifts and stuff, like it'd be like, oh, that's what we do, because we do the same thing with alcohol. I'm recently alcohol free as of November, and like we really screw with our bodies for alcohol and feeling the buzz of that, like way more so than I'm imagining like a lot of other things. So the fact that so many women just go into birth control because everyone does it, they feel safety in numbers, when in fact, like guys, just because it's not a norm is the only reason it probably doesn't exist. And it's all the, the men that
Yeah,
are putting up the red flag and be like, I'm getting acne out of this. This is unreasonable. Meanwhile,
exactly.
we've been
And
inviting
so
and
many
encouraging
women
women to do
experience
this for the
side
longest period of
effects. And
time.
there are stories, not stories, studies that show that women experience a decrease in well being in the long run when they take the pill. So there are conflicting studies on depression and suicide risk, but there are some high quality studies on decreased well-being, and the side effects can't be ignored. But unfortunately, we have normalized side effects for women, and we have normalized pain for women. We tell women, oh, extreme period pain, that's normal. Painful IUD insertion, that's normal. Pain with breastfeeding, oh, just wait a few months, it might get better. And that's something that we have unfortunately normalized as a society. And I think it's partly because it's been convenient and it's been cheaper. And it's partly also because we tell women to be nice. This whole idea of be nice and give us a smile and be ladylike.
Mm.
And when you continuously tell someone to not complain and not be nice, you get to a situation where women are less likely to complain about side effects of medication, for example. And women are also less likely to get pain relief when reporting the same symptoms as men. So it has all these various repercussions.
Mm. Yeah, and I don't know if you went on to the masculinity side of it too, but I think there's been an interesting. So I've been reading For the Love of Men by Liz Plank in our book club, and one of the things that has been brought up of, I'll add you to the study here. It's a really short study. Is when if I were to bring up to you that you're in the
Yeah, fear.
next 2 months you're going to be homeless, what's the first emotion that hits for you? Fear. So I would argue for most men and the majority of the ones that I've talked to, the first one we feel, assuming we have the vocabulary for it, is shame. And so many men like feel shame because we're expected to be the provider in the home. And so that's like the first one that shows up quicker than fear. And I almost wonder similarly when we look at making, oh shit, I lost my train of thought. When we're looking at
Mm-hmm.
men making changes, women, pain women, is
Mm-hmm.
that when
Mm-hmm.
men are feeling
Mm-hmm.
pain,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because we expect them to hold back and be
Yes.
tough and like
Yeah.
be a man, that when they finally say
Yeah.
I'm in pain,
Yeah.
we're like, oh, we believe him because
Exactly. Absolutely. It goes
we
both
know
ways.
he sticks to the code of masculinity, which is men don't feel pain. And so it's like, it's really interesting seeing the other side of that, and how
Mm.
it's also like the way that I almost feel like men can be an advocate for this
Mm.
is also almost expressing pain quicker and not fighting it and changing the norm of what we
Yeah.
see around like masculinity and what kind of pain feels like. Because I'm wondering if the quicker we are advocating for pain relief, the more normalized things could get even for the other side. Because if we're coming down
Mm,
and like we need pain relief quicker, I'm wondering if it could change the other end of the
yeah.
spectrum too
Yeah,
and
that's a
help
really good idea
people see,
because it
oh
comes
yeah,
down
that
to
that hurts for
communication,
everybody,
right? And
not
if we're all
just
encouraged to
men
just
apparently.
communicate pain and not suck it up and not be brave or pretend it's not there, then absolutely, I think that could be a real change.
I want to ask for some coaching from you here. So I'm going to a book launch
Oh
event
yeah.
for Neha Rush, The Power of Pause, in Boston on Thursday. And as I was sharing about it online, I found myself navigating. So actually, I'll preface it with one of the other things that you've shared before is that when you were talking with
Mm,
people about like FemTech,
yeah.
it was considered like a niche
Yeah.
industry, despite it being 51, like 50 fucking percent of people, like, oh, that's a niche industry. Meanwhile, when we look at like men's products specific to men, like that, I'm imagining that would not be viewed the same way. It wouldn't be considered niche. And so I'm almost wondering if there's a similarity to the way that I talk about my niche. Is, you know, I was talking, I put a story on my Instagram and I said, hey, I'm going to this event talking about the
Hmm.
power of pause, and, you know, a bunch of my like momfluencer friends are going to be there. There's just like, as I was saying it, I was like, how do I say this that communicates to the people that in the language that they understand, so that like they understand what I'm saying, but at the same time, like, how do I be an advocate for progress in that like the power of pause isn't, it's it's a issue, and it's like
Hmm.
there's going to be a lot of value for women to be able to find empowerment in their in pausing on their financial and their careers. However, it's going to, I would arguably say, it
Hmm.
would equally impact, when that is embraced, it will equally impact both men and women. And so like, how do I, when I think about like my niche and talking about mental load, I recognize that like it's also that like my audience is 91% women. So like, how do I adjust the way that I'm talking about my
Mm,
niche so that it is not as much of a woman centric thing? And so I guess like, what's something that you would be saying to a brand that has, you know, products that are more specifically for women, but like they're trying to break
yeah,
past this
that's a great
idea that
question
this
because
is a
mental
niche
load is also one of
industry, a
those
niche
things
topic?
that's invisible, right? And there's so much power in making it visible, a bit like vagina, internal, invisible, hidden, right? But so important. And once you make it visible, you really change
Yeah.
people's understanding. And once you find the words and you find the visual language and you figure out anatomy and so on, it's very powerful. I think when people think about the mental load, most of them probably think about gender inequalities at home. So, women doing domestic chores and doing childcare and making decisions about school. But it goes so much further than that, right? And when I was thinking about our conversation, I thought, where does it actually begin? It doesn't begin when you have kids, it begins much sooner than that. Like we've said, with contraception and with pregnancy as well, and with birth, because there is such a big mental load to being pregnant. And I think sometimes society gaslights us a bit into thinking, you're pregnant and you're supposed to function exactly the way you did before, when in reality, the majority of women either have morning sickness or pregnancy insomnia. Up to 80% have morning sickness, and I think 70% have pregnancy insomnia, maybe the other way around, but you're likely to have one of those two things. And if men had morning sickness, it wouldn't be called that. It would be called killer disease. I don't know. But it sounds so cute. In reality, morning sickness can be really debilitating. And it's not just in the morning, it's the whole day. And some women just
Wow, I
have to
never
stay
thought
in
about
bed
that.
for months and can't do much and get dehydrated because they can't eat and they're throwing up. So I think pregnancy is not always, but oftentimes physically and mentally and emotionally very demanding. And so, how can you, as a partner, how can you help in that situation? Can you be the one who cooks healthy meals, and can you give your partner a massage? Can you explain to your friends why she's asleep at 5 p.m. because she's really tired? So I think there's a lot that partners can do, including all the logistics around having a baby and looking into the right stroller and the nappies and all the things, the bassinet, all the things that you need. And then the same applies to giving birth, because there's so many different ways of giving birth. And I was giving a talk recently. A friend of mine came along with her husband, and she told me, I'm so glad I brought my husband because he had never heard of the epidural before. And so I was talking about the epidural. And I think it's so important to
Hmm.
understand what all of those options are. So, to go to birth preparation classes together, to know what your partner's preferences are so that in the situation you can be there to support, because obviously it's not your body, it's not your choice, and the woman should be making the decisions. If she wants a planned C-section, that's her choice. If she wants to give birth in a birthing pool with scented candles, that's her choice, and you should be supporting that. But you're there to bring her comfort and to make her feel loved, and that has a huge impact on how a birth experience unfolds. And it's one of the most memorable experiences in a woman's life. So to be there and to be an advocate and to be somebody who creates who helps to create a positive experience, I think is very, very powerful. And the same goes so I've seen a study on menopause which showed that women who are in heterosexual relationships who had supportive partners had less severe menopause symptoms. And there's a condition called vaginismus where
Hmm.
the muscles of the vagina contract involuntarily. And I spoke to a company called Materna Medical. They have a device that can help with that condition. And they told me that women with supportive partners were more likely to make progress with the device. So I think there's a really strong mind body connection. And if you're supported, um, you're more likely to just feel better and do better. So it's actually the more I think about it, the more I feel it's such a
Hmm.
huge topic. It's not niche at all. I feel the mental load is really underlying all of women's health. And so if you can share that load, it's really powerful. I don't know if that answers your question. I feel like I got carried away a bit. But when it comes to the pause, the power of the
Yeah.
pause, I think we have shared parental leave here in the UK. And there are studies that show that men who take parental
Hmm.
leave have report higher life satisfaction and better relationships and so on. And that it also helps to close the gender pay gap, because for every additional month that a father takes, the mother's salary goes up. There's a study in Sweden that was done on that. Yeah. And I think the pause can be powerful for any
Hmm.
parent, right? Having that moment
Yeah, I could totally see
in your
that.
life where you gain all of these new skills and you're resilient in a completely new way. And you learn so much about human nature and about the world and about how to make things happen. I think that's powerful for everyone.
Yeah, and I took four months off, and I thought that my ability to understand what she was going through was so much more increased than if I had taken 3 or 2 weeks.
Yeah. And your
Like
relationship and
imagining
your
how that would have
confidence in
gone differently
yourself,
if I'd
right? And
not
your
spent that same
skills
time
and
on
the
there.
proximity that you have with your child and your capabilities. I think it's so important. I think the world would be a very different place if it was completely normal for all fathers to take 6 months off.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Marina, I'm so glad that I got to talk to you today. I'm looking forward to. I haven't started reading the book 'cause I'm still I got a little bit of backlog, but looking forward to it. And I'm looking forward to just dropping the word vagina in almost an excessive amount into the conversations that I
Yeah,
have,
we'll
and
see.
or we'll see if Instagram tries
Hmm.
to bleep me out.
Yeah.
There was one thing when I'm sure you've seen Mark Zuckerberg came out with that video talking about like how we're gonna cut back on the restraints and stuff. And I thought if I were to be optimistic, maybe we can say vagina without getting bleeped. Maybe we can say some of the other words without that
Mm.
being flagged. Because I know that there have been people that talked about
Yeah.
like the views on things will go
We'll
down
see what happens.
and
Yeah.
like you'll get kind of shadow banned. So it'll be interesting to see if maybe there is some small positive. If there's conspiracy theories that are going to be flying around what much more, maybe we can also change
Yeah.
the
Let's hope so.
perception on how these words are being used and put into the atmosphere. All right. I know people can find you on Instagram.
Yeah, Instagram and LinkedIn,
Where's
and
the
I also
favorite
have a
place that
Substack
you encourage
newsletter
people to
that I
go
don't
to?
have much time for right now because I have a baby, but I will get back to it at one point. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you
Yeah,
again
thank you
for
so
being with
much
me
for the
here today,
conversation. It's been
and
really
I
fun.
look forward to sharing more about your book in the near
And
future.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.